We are more conservative in a business perspective of saying that my opinion is the one that matters. Not that your opinion doesn't matter, but I'm the owner. I'm the one who makes the calls here and I'm the one who takes the shots. There's a Brazilian expression that says that you have to speak the language of the place that you are going. It means to understand the values, to understand these relationships that were created and show that you're doing something different, not because you're better than us, but because you have something that we don't.
Hello and welcome to Brazil is Not for Beginners. Today my guest is Saulo Castro. Saulo is a corporate law partner at Valença Associados, and we are going to talk about the northeast of Brazil. Saulo, thanks so much for joining me. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Isaac. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk a little bit about what we do, to talk a little bit about the Nordeste, and also host a podcast from our firm. So it's the first time that I'm the other side of the table. So very excited to be here.
I'm excited to be putting you in that position, put you in the fire this time, under the microscope. We spend a lot of time on this podcast, obviously talking about Brazil, and me living in Sao Paulo and having lived in Rio, my network, and frankly, I think most people's exposure to Brazil is very much concentrated here in the Southeast. And so I'm really excited for us to talk about a different region, the Nordeste, a region that's known for its beaches and beautiful weather, but we're going to talk about its business and culture. And so before we get started diving in there, can you introduce yourself? You mentioned you host a podcast and you're a partner at a law firm. So please share a little bit more about yourself before we get going.
I'm Saulo Castro. I'm 32 years old. I'm a corporate law attorney in the Northeast. I also lived in the Southeast to learn a little bit about what you guys do, to see different cultures. I lived in the US as well. I have a few things that I do also professionally, not as a hobby. So I'm a bass player, I'm a cook. And during our conversation, I'll try to bring this up a little bit more to connect with the things that I think are very important for us here.
Excellent. A bass player and a cook from the Northeast. So I'm excited for moqueca and fajo. Both are going to be great.
You would be surprised if I told you that horror is actually pretty hard to play. So I like to call myself a jazz bass player.
Excellent. I love jazz. I dreamed of being a jazz bass player at one point. I really liked it. But I also really love fajo, a very traditional Northeastern music. Can you talk a little bit about what is the Northeast? So if you're in Sao Paulo and somebody says, I'm going to the Nordeste, or oh, those people are from the Nordeste, what is that region? What encompasses it geographically? And talk a little bit about its unique culture and why it stands out as a region.
The first thing that I'll say to someone who never came here before is that it's a beach place. We used to joke around. It's the place where the people from the southeast comes to spend their vacations. The northeast is pretty known for one of the states that we have here, Salvador, Bahia, is the place that it was first discovered by the Portuguese. It's one of the famous. So we have Fortaleza, Ceará, that's where I'm from and where I'm speaking right now, Recife. It's one of the places that usually people go to see the beaches where there's tranquility. Like I told you, I lived in São Paulo. So when I was there, I heard a lot of the people saying, what are you doing here? Why did you leave that paradise and came here? But I think answering your question, we are known for the beaches, especially. People come here to find something that they don't see very often where they come from. For example, I live literally in the front of the ocean. So every Friday, I go to the sea, have a little bath, and then I come back, put my suit, and go to the office. And I can assure you it's a different kind of perspective to approach the job.
Yeah, I think you're making all of our urban listeners very jealous by doing that. I've only spent a little bit of time in the Northeast. It's certainly unique. Can you talk a little bit about the history of the region? For instance, you mentioned that Salvador de Bahia was the first place the Europeans encountered South America.
Yes.
And so also a very large Afro-Brazilian population. Can you talk a little bit about the history, the unique development of the Northeast?
I love history. It's been one of my passions since I was a little kid. So by the end of the high school, I did a little project to understand a little bit about the culture and the history from our region. So we called here, from the history perspective, a different kind of colonization. When the Europeans came in the 1500s, they usually came from the beach, from the shore to the countryside, especially here, for example, in Ceará, Pernambuco, and a few states that there were very much interest from the Portuguese perspective. They did what we call a backwards or an upside down colonization, because it was from the countryside to the beach. And there's one
Interesting.
particular reason, because the Indians that used to live on the beach back then were very ferocious. So they tried the other way around, and that's what we call backwards colonization. And from that perspective, a lot of the things that we are, or who we have as a reference, or why we invested so much in agriculture and all those things, are definitely related to the people that colonized us, because we had the Portuguese and the Spanish, for example, going from the shore to the countryside. So, for example, São Paulo, it was very famous for the agriculture, the sugar production. And from here, we didn't have that, because you need the beach, and the beach had the engines. So we tried a different kind. We tried the animals. We tried a different kind of agriculture, and that influenced very much our history, our values, and all the things that make us Nordestinos, Northeasterns. So this backward, this upside down colonization made us a little bit different from the other regions. Like I mentioned before, Salvador was the first place that the Europeans found out. So it was the number one gate from slave market, and that represents a lot of the place. Until today, we have a lot of churches, we have a lot of expressions that were created, and they're based on the story that these African people came here and input in our culture. So I like to think that Brazilians, not only the Northeast, but the Brazilians as a whole, are mixed, and it's one big mixture of all of these different cultures. I don't recall any other country with that many different approaches from the historical perspective to be so different and so much blended.
Yeah. So on that point, what you mentioned about the agriculture is very interesting. I think Festa Junina is big everywhere, but it's a different level of big in the Northeast. What are some of the big cultural moments or experiences that somebody going to the Northeast or learning about the Northeast would hear about? So, for instance, what is Festa Junina?
I actually did this analogy for a friend that came here from New York. He's a New Yorker, just like yourself. And he asked me, what is Festa Junina? And I was trying to explain to him, it's like St. Patrick's Day, and we dress up as the guys that colonized us back in the 1600s and the 1700s. They were something like cowboys. We call them vaqueiros. They were responsible for taking the animals from the countryside to the beach. So we dress up. It's in June. It's the whole month of June, the festival. And we celebrate the traditions that these people created and they brought up to us. So it's pretty much our carnival. It's probably my favorite time of the year.
I think it's my wife's favorite holiday as well. She loves drawing the mustache on my son, dressing up in vaquero clothes, eating lots of special foods.
Yeah, thinking about our analogy, I think it was something like the guys that colonized California in the gold race in the 1800s. It's pretty much the same thing. I think it's a better analogy than St. Patrick's.
Interesting. Yeah, I always equated it a bit more with Thanksgiving, thinking it was more about the harvest, but I didn't know about the history. So I think that when you come into things, you don't necessarily know the background, and then you uncover the stories of how they develop. And that's why these conversations are so great.
The Northeastern is usually very proud of being kind of different, and they're colonized different from the rest of the country. So we like to say, joking, of course, but we are a country of our own because we are kind of very different from the other regions.
I find it very interesting that Spanish Latin America broke up into many countries and Brazil was able to stay together. And I think that there's Laurentino Gomez wrote his famous books about the discovery of Brazil and the creation of the empire and some of the things that factored in there. And, Brazil is very diverse. I think it's funny that it is seen a bit of as a monolith. People don't realize how big and diverse Brazil is, but it's seen as one place and there are all of these differences. And so that's why I'm so interested in this conversation we're having. But going a little bit deeper, we've talked a little bit about some of the culture and some of the fun things, but people do need to pay their bills and people do work there as well. And so you, as a corporate lawyer, work with a number of companies, right? So local companies, national companies, international companies. Can you talk a little bit about what drives the economy of the region? So obviously you mentioned tourism and you also mentioned the agriculture, but what is the industry of the Northeast? What drives the economy? What is the business environment like?
Since the 1980s, the economy in the Northeast changed drastically. We changed and we passed over different sectors of business. Historically, we are agriculture sector, but since the 1980s and the 1990s, we discovered the energy sector and we had this incredible opportunity that the foreign companies realized we have a lot of wind. So the renewable energy companies came here from Germany, from India, from the UK, from the US, and they realized that they could make an industry of their own. So since the 2000s, 2010s, we actually were pretty hyped in this segment. To be precise, for example, CRI is already self sustainable just with renewable energy. We wouldn't have to use a thermal electric power if we don't want to use it. And nowadays, with the ESG, it's growing in our society for all the environment, for the sustainability. This market, it's pretty much in evidence. We're trying to be in the vanguard of this kind of sector here in Brazil.
When you say industry, just out of curiosity, is it textile? Is it heavy machinery? What kind of industry are you talking about there?
So Bev, it's one of the clients that we have in our firm, and I can say that because I'm allowed to. It's one of the companies that created and put the Northeast in a different perspective in the 1980s. Before Jorge Paulo Lemann bought and became what is known today as InBev or Ambev, we have also the textile industry because of the cotton harvest and the cotton agriculture. So the textile industries came here and they created a city of their own. So the outside of Fortaleza, for example, here in Ceará, it's all covered by industries, textile industries. And I'll say pretty much the Northeast was grown on these two or three sectors.
Very cool. I want to get back to also the ESG points you made with COP20 coming to Belém. I don't know if Belém counts as the Northeast or if it's a different region.
It's in the north.
Right. So it's close by, but that's coming. And so I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about the sustainability piece. But I'm also interested, maybe before we get there, about work culture. So you mentioned you lived and worked in Sao Paulo. I think Sao Paulo has a pretty strong work culture, similar to a lot of big cities, right? So people work long hours in offices. Obviously there's the unique Brazilian attributes. People are not as direct, maybe as Americans or Europeans. But what is the work culture like in the Northeast? And how does it differ from other regions?
I'll start by saying that majorly the companies that we created were family business. Approximately 90 to 95% of the companies that we have here, they're family business. And I'm easily saying this number because one of the jobs and one of the things that we do in my area, and it's one of the things that I learned to do, it's wealth planning. So we have companies here that are passed on generations. We have families that established business of almost 200 years. We had a drinking company that was sold to Johnny Walker and the Diageo company, the largest drinking company in the world. They had 185, 186 years. I think it was like five or six generations. I think the 60th was the one that sold the company for 900 million reais. So it was like one of the major operations that we saw in the Northeast. And by saying that usually they're a family business, we have a very strong culture of the founding member or the family that created the company. They usually work 24/7. They don't know holidays, they don't know vacations, they don't take day off. And we say that he worked 365 days in a year and 366 if they were able to work 366. So there's a very strong presence and a very centralized idea of I'm the one who created the business and I know what I'm doing. We don't see this very much in the Southeast because there's a more corporate culture that is very different from the family business culture. By saying that, I saw a few years ago a few movements of companies that came here, for example, law firms, talking about my segment, a few law firms trying to make this introduction here in the Northeast, and they were unsuccessful or they probably didn't work out as much as they think that it would. And that I think is because of this difference of perspective. And I see this, for example, in a proposal. So usually the Americans, the Europeans, or actually in Sao Paulo, we have our fees and it's an hourly fee. And we're going to work for 20 hours, for example. And we're going to charge, I don't know how much for this 20 hours. If I work 25, it'll be a little bit different. Over
Mhm.
here, it's a kind of hard thing to do this because sometimes the C-level family doesn't want to know how many hours they were going to pay exactly what you treated with them. So we set the price there. This is how much I'm going to pay you. They don't want to know if you take 10 or 100 hours. So I think this is the main challenge here. We are more conservative in a business perspective of saying that my opinion is the one that matters. Not that your opinion doesn't matter, but I'm the owner. I'm the one who makes the calls here and I'm the one who takes the shots. So if I want to take a shot in that business over there, or if I want to buy a company over there, it doesn't matter if my board, for example, is telling me not to do it. I am the board. Okay. So it's very centralized figures.
No, I think that's really interesting. I think it makes sense, right? So if it's a family business, then the family lives and breathes it, right? It's more than just a job to them. It is their livelihood, it is their legacy, it is the family, right? And I don't come from family business, so I don't know it, but I know some people that work at it, and you can see gender stereotypes and things, right? Or women taking over. But there's also just the pressure, the weight of the history that falls on people that you need to live up to that expectation. You talked a little bit about you working with them as a lawyer, but how does that manifest itself within the company? So if I'm working for a family business, what is that culture like? Am I given latitude to make decisions? Am I able to have autonomy? Am I able to rise up? Am I always going to be excluded because I'm not part of the family? Is it a big family, right? So sometimes you'll see these family businesses where everybody that works there is a family to some degree, and there's a sense of responsibility that the owners have to the workers. How does that, and obviously we're talking in gross generalizations here, and every business is unique. How does this history of family businesses and this history of centralized ownership and decision making manifest itself in the actual work culture of those businesses?
I like to say that the family business companies usually make their decisions in their Sunday lunch family reunion. The Sunday is when all the generations usually come to the grandparents to have lunch together. It's a kind of family reunion. It's inevitable to talk about business. Okay, so once you have a broken family, you don't have Sunday family reunion. You don't have a company's strategical decisions to make. That's very important. So, to answer your question, I'll give you an example. Last Friday, I went to a meeting with the second generation of a family business. Okay, father found the company about 30 years, 40 years ago, and their two oldest sons are now taking over and they're going through due diligence projects to probably sell the company. And in order to do that, they have to organize a little bit a few things. Father is not married to the mother of the two oldest. So we have a kind of conflict between what the second generation wants and what the first generation. We see this show up more in these decisions. Naturally, the second, the third, the newest generation, it's more inclined to technology. They're more inclined to bring up people that will add up knowledges from the market that they usually work with. The first generation are kind of try to avoid that a little bit. So this is probably one of the things that we see the most this conflict between what the first and the second generation wants. So I think that combined with not very well established ground rules, governance rules in the business can have a problem over there. So I think this is pretty much 80%, 70% of the problems that I see that I'm approached with. Okay, this different type of thinking, more technology, more vanguard, more foot on the gas, I would say.
Yeah, well, I think, company transition is a very interesting space because you have different types of families, right? You'll have the next generation that
Yes.
wants to take over, you have the next generation that wants to sell. You have the next
Yes.
generation that wants to implement technology and bring in processes, professionalize it in
Yeah.
quotes, right? Whereas maybe the previous generation is confident that they know it by the feel. When I was a consultant, I remember I was talking to some CFOs for a project, and their comment was, well, you can kind of smell the problems, right? So if you've lived in the
Yes.
books for 20 years, then you know when something's off. You have a sense of it. If you're taking over and you haven't been living it, then you need something to help you find that sense until you develop the familiarity with something. And I think that's very interesting and very relevant to this conversation. Just going a little bit deeper on this topic, and you brought it up, you gave the example just now of the companies that have come to the Northeast and have struggled. And you said before,
Yes.
it seems like companies from the Northeast have been maybe more successful at going outside of the Northeast.
Yes, I was talking about the legal business itself. So we see this movement that the firms from the Southeast tried to come here and establish their firms here, but they weren't very successful, I would say. And we're doing this now. We're leaving the Southeast and trying to be a more national law firm.
Gotcha. Do we see this in other industries as well, or rather that Northeastern companies are better at going to other geographies than are companies from other geographies coming to the Northeast?
I don't know if it's better or worse. Since the 1980s, a lot of the companies that were implemented in the Southeast came to the Northeast and they
Okay.
established a very successful business. What we see right now is from the 2000s, the 2010s, Northeast companies going and nationalize their products. They're becoming bigger. We have a few examples like Apivida, the health plan that it's very popular right now. They're buying pretty much everybody in their sector. They are our clients. I'm very proud to say that. We have drugstores like Pagmenos that they started right here and nowadays they're all over the country. We
Yep.
have the mail industry like Emidias Branco. They make bread, they make cookies, they make all of the rivers that come from the mill. They are buying companies from Sao Paulo, from Rio, and all of these companies are in their stock exchange market, B3, the Brazilian Stock Exchange, and we have now a pretty new one, Brisanet, the company founded by one guy in the countryside, a very, very, very small place. And he went to Sao Paulo, worked in Embraer, learned about the Brazilian Embraer. They saw this opportunity regarding internet in the countryside, and they now are in the Brazilian Stock Exchange, and they're developing the 5G in the country. It's pretty remarkable what this guy did. I had the opportunity to talk with him. I went there to see by myself what he created, and I had the chance to talk with him. And he has two nephews that he called up and say, "Okay, I'm developing this. Come work with me."
Another
And
family business.
yeah, yeah. And it's different because he has one daughter. She's right now in medical school and she doesn't want to be in the business, at least until now. And these two nephews, they're wingmen to develop it. So we're seeing this different movement of companies that they were created here going across the borders of the Northeast. Usually we stay here and we cover the Northeast, but now we are covering the whole country.
Very interesting. Going a little bit deeper, when companies come to the Northeast, what do they tend to struggle with? So you mentioned obviously the kind of dynamics of family businesses. I imagine that manifests itself in it just being a very relationship driven economy where you need to know people. What do companies that come to Northeast, whether they're national companies or international companies, what do companies struggle with and what have they been successful at?
I think being successful means to understand the place. I know it's very generally and not very specific, but to understand the people, to understand their values. The Northeasterners, they don't think anything is taken for granted until you prove it. Okay. And in order to actually to respect you, I would say, You have to pay your dues and you have to show me more than once. You have to show me every day. Northeasterns, they like to see hard work. They are hard workers people. If you understand that, I'm pretty sure you're going to be successful. You have to understand the place that you're going and their values. I don't think companies didn't work mainly because of that, but I think that is the main challenge here. There's a Brazilian expression that says that you have to speak the language of the place that you are going. So it means to understand the values, to understand these relationships that were created and show that you're doing something different, not because you're better than us, but pretty much because you have something that we don't. The main challenge is this one. Companies that achieved something, they actually hired employees from local companies and said, I need you to take over and be charged to understand this place.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. We've talked about this on the podcast before, mostly about coming to Brazil. So we've done a few episodes about how to launch products in Brazil or how the tech sector is evolving. And I think that we hear similar types of comments of localize your solution, work with local partners, hire locally, understand the context of where you are and the importance of bringing that local knowledge and that local perspective. And it sounds like you mentioned the Northeast jokes that it's its own country. Maybe in that respect, it kind of is that you need people that also understand that local context of the Northeast, right? The importance of family relationships, how the work culture manifests itself, what is seen as hard work, things along those lines. So, very interesting and very helpful for people that are thinking about the Northeast. You mentioned earlier about the sustainability issue, and we mentioned that COP20 is coming to Belém. Can you talk
Mhm.
a little bit more about that agenda and how it's being realized in the Northeast? I imagine from an agricultural perspective as well. Where do you see this idea of sustainability growing in the Northeast? Sometimes when you talk about sustainability, it becomes a bit of a political hot point. And I understand that the Northeast is a more conservative area, but is also investing heavily in sustainability.
I would say we're more conservative from a business perspective, business decisions.
No, but I think from a political perspective as well, if I understand the country correctly.
Yeah, we're more liberal, if I would say, historically. Uh, and there's a political agenda regarding the sustainability, but I'll try to get away with it. We are the country that is known from the Amazon forest, the rainforest. I like to think that we have a natural responsibility with the whole world in terms of trying to work solutions. There's a challenge because of the size that we need to solve, or probably I would say that work out a little bit more objective and pretty much doable solutions. So the agenda of the COP20, personally, I think it's how do you connect the problems that we have as a society and regarding the Amazon forest, for example, and how do you connect that with the business, because we need to create business and we need to keep bringing investors here. And what I'm seeing right now is for example, the renewable energy. It's a path that it is open. We can do this without deforestation, for example. We don't have to probably construct another thermoelectric power unit just to have power. So I think the political thing, it's a kind of an abstract thing. But the problems that we have as a society, they're pretty much real, and we need to see that probably don't have sides of a fight. We have a whole as a society that we need to work with.
No, I think that makes sense. I think that you're seeing it, right? People want to work,
Yes.
the economy wants to develop, they want to provide for themselves and their families. And so, where there's opportunities, whether it's working in a thermoelectric plant or a wind power plant, they're a little bit agnostic to it. They just want places where they know that they're going to be able to support themselves and survive, and trying to stay away from the political agenda because there's plenty of other podcasts that talk about that.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see the investments in alternative energies, better agricultural practices being done from a business perspective, not anything to do with the environmental perspective. And obviously, it'll have that externality later of it just being a more sustainable business and so providing for the longer term. Are there any other examples that you'd think about beyond that? Can you maybe even talk a little bit more about how these foreign companies are looking at the energy sector in the Northeast?
Usually, big companies, for example, when they come here, they need a power plant unit. So they build their own power plant unit based on a renewable energy. Some power energy, for example, wind energy. I think it's the two of them. They usually talk with the local government to say, I'm going to build this power plant unit here, and probably you lay off some taxes in the next 10 or 15 years.
These are other industries, so these are not energy companies.
Yes, I would say that they're mining companies, they're agriculture companies. I think the main challenge here is to show everyone that you don't have to be a successful business and not be sustainable. They are antagonized from a political thing, but I think you can nowadays see that you can make your business work and also be sustainable.
Very cool. I think that's a great point to end on here. What does the expression Brazil is not for beginners mean to you?
I love the podcast name. I would say that means every day something new may show up that was very impossible or improbable to happen. This expression means I don't think there's anything that wouldn't happen here in Brazil.
I understand that. I live it every day. So I think that makes sense.
Yes.
There's always
Yes.
unexpected things that come up. And that's a great way to think about it. I always like to end my podcast asking, are there any unique expressions or habits that foreigners don't understand or maybe that stand out uniquely? And I'm wondering if maybe you can talk maybe less about Brazil and more about the Northeast. So I know, for instance, in Rio, one of the big things is vamos marcar, which has come up a bunch of times. And one of the
Mhm.
expressions from the Northeast that I heard was achei pouco, which I thought was really great. So something bad happened to somebody and somebody says achei pouco. I thought it was too little. It's bad, but it's almost like that wasn't enough. It wasn't bad enough, which I really loved that one. But are there any Brazilian expressions or habits that you'd share with our audience?
I would say simbora. Simbora means let's go, but we use it for pretty much everything. So we have a business plan, simbora. There's a party, simbora. It means I agree with you. It means let's go. It means I don't think this is going to work. It means pretty much everything regarding the context that you're saying. For example, yesterday I was scheduling a tennis match with my friend, and he said that we have to stop to buy some new balls. And I said, simbora. It means that no problem, man. This is a small thing. Just let's go.
Awesome. Saulo, thank you so much for joining me and teaching me a little bit about the history of the Northeast and its work culture. This was great. I was feeling that we were over indexed to Sao Paulo and Rio, and we needed to get a bit more perspective on other cultures. And I think you really helped with that. How can people reach you if they'd like to learn more about the work that you do in the region or want to engage with you on something that's going on there? How can people reach you? What's the best way?
People can reach me through my firm, Valença Associados. We are full service. We have over 30 areas: civil law, labor, tax, corporate, real estate, and on and on and on. We have over 200 lawyers spread out from 6 law firms across the country. And we like to say that we solve all of our clients' problems at home. And people can reach me more directly from my LinkedIn, Saulo Castro, and my Instagram page, Saulo Castro 1. This is pretty much you can see what we do every day. You can see our achievements and our challenges as a law firm.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And thanks everyone for listening. Thanks again for joining us. This podcast was hosted by me, Isaac Matzner. It was produced and edited by Maria Filmis. You can find more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube, as well as on our Substack page. We do love feedback, so please feel free to reach out to us on social media or via email at Brazil, 4, beginners@gmail.com.